Hey everyone, welcome back to Rocks for Jocks. My name is Alex and I'm going to be your host for the show. In today's episode, I have with me David Zabner, a fourth year PhD student at Tufts University, whose research is on computer science education. Before his PhD started, David had a couple of different roles, most prominently starting and building his own tech company, which he's going to talk a little bit about today. So I don't normally do too much background on the topic itself being discussed, but I thought this one was pretty important. So I want to talk a little bit about why I think computer science education is so important and why I thought it was interesting to highlight some of the research being done there. So I want to be a little bit careful with my wording because I know everyone feels differently about this, but I would describe computer science as notoriously difficult to teach and learn for a couple of different reasons, especially for beginners. So the biggest challenge I've seen is that computer science education can actually mean a few different things depending on who you ask. The first and maybe most traditional is talking about the actual science behind computers, how they work, how they interact through processes like the internet. Nowadays, this question probably leans a little bit more towards computer engineering, but a lot of people still consider computer science as needing to know about how computers themselves work at a pretty decent level. The second important facet of computer science that you might hear people talking about when they're trying to teach it or learn about it is basically going to be about how to design computer applications. So if you're trying to build an application or a website for people to use, there's a bunch of different ways to basically design how that website functions. So that's going to be using terms you may have heard before like structures, or algorithms, or databases, or cloud infrastructure. Most of those terms are pretty vague, even to myself, who's learned about them a little bit. But yeah, there's a lot of detail you can really dive into if you're interested. And then thirdly, there's the actual typing of the code that some people consider as part of computer science education. This is sometimes referred to as coding or programming. So when you hear us use those terms today, that's generally what I'm referring to is taking the ideas of computer science and trying to actually put them into code for a computer to understand what you want it to do. For a lot of people, I would argue that programming doesn't really come naturally to them. I would argue it's kind of like learning a second language or a third language. It's kind of gibberish at the beginning, and you can slowly start to build up more complex phrases and sentences over time. But yeah, you have to really start with learning the basic terminology that's called syntax. So that's going to be a phrase we use a couple times today. And then yeah, you can, as I said, you can start building up more complicated vocabulary and phrases and stuff like that over time. Even more confusingly, there are also a ton of different coding languages you can learn, some of which are for like a general purpose language like Python, whereas some have really specific use cases. Whether that's for like building the homepage of a website, or some are really specific for interacting with certain parts of a computer on a really deep level, that kind of thing. So to recap why I think computer science education it gets pretty confusing, there's three pretty distinct facets of computer science education, at least in the way that I think about it. There's basically how computers work and interact is number one. Then the second is going to be how to design things like applications and how to structure algorithms that you want to put together. And then lastly, there is how to actually code things. So that's going to be the syntax and the programming and that kind of stuff. Some people and places prioritize one or two of those goals over the others. So for example, most universities, at least from what I've seen and heard from others, most universities prioritize how computers work and how to design applications and algorithms and that kind of thing. But they don't really teach much programming. And then on the other hand, online courses that I've seen focus almost exclusively on the programming side of things, with a lot less focus on why you're taking certain steps, why certain best practices exist, that kind of thing. They just kind of give you the syntax of the code and have you work on it from there. As a result of all of this, there can be some pretty different standards amongst computer science graduates, even from the same school or from the same online boot camp. When those graduates are entering or trying to build up their skills in the job market, sometimes they end up focusing on different things and learning at different paces, maybe taking different learning strategies altogether. Yeah, so hopefully that is some good background for why computer science is so hard to teach and also so hard to learn, and why improving education around it can be really helpful. So yeah, with all of that said, let's go hear directly from the source, from someone who's making that education a little bit better. If you like this episode, please subscribe and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. It makes a huge difference to growing the channel. And if you really like it, send it to a friend. I promise they are going to absolutely love it and love you even more than they already do. Thanks for listening. David Zabner, how's it going? What drew you out here to Boston?
So in 2013, I graduated college. I double majored in biochemistry and computer science. And I moved out here to get a job at a startup. I did a program called the Startup Institute here in Boston, which doesn't exist anymore. Did that for 2 months over the summer, and then I got a job at a company called Gemvara for 3 months. And then I helped some folks start a startup called Casino, and I ended up working there for about 6 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
And then a little bit of consulting. During that time, I also did a bunch of teaching at the Startup Institute, which I really liked.
Nice. What kind of teaching did you do there?
So I was teaching web development, and then also the big thing the Startup Institute did, which I thought was really valuable, was focus pretty seriously on soft skills. So like, how do you interact with coworkers? How do you interview? How do you network? What does it mean to be working at a startup, right? Yes, your primary job is writing the software because you're a software engineer, but like, how do you get on a sales call and chat with customers? We focused a lot on that stuff as well. So I primarily stuck to the web dev, but a little bit of the other stuff as well.
So I'm guessing then that was a little bit of actually getting onto sales calls then and actually trying to pitch the product to customers, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How'd you like that?
It was really fun. It was really interesting. In 2013, I was 22, and there I was on a sales call with like the chief technical officer of Marks and Spencer, which is a really big retailer in the UK, chatting about what our product was going to look like and how it could serve them.
Cool. So then what drew you into academia from there? Tell me a little bit about that transition.
Yeah. Well, actually, after 5 years of working at Casino, which was the company I helped found, I realized I was loving the teaching even more than the software. And so I decided, hey, I should get a PhD in computer science. And the first question on that application for the PhD is, what kind of computer science do you want to do research on, right? AI, robotics, human-computer interaction. There's a whole long list. And I didn't have an answer to that. So I decided I'd get a master's first. During the master's, in the fall of my second year, I took an education class. And I tell people it radicalized me. I was a TA for an intro CS class at the same time. And so I'd go to what was supposed to be like a lecture about education. And it was this super interactive, constructive conversation about what we'd read, about how we think, about how humans learn, about how that can be like joyful and immersive and meaningful. And then I'd go to the office hours for this class where I was a TA, and students would just like show up and cry. And I'd go to the lecture, and the professor for the course, spectacular lecturer, really engaging, fun to watch, the whole deal. And still, in a classroom with 300 students, right, there's like 45 of them are asleep, 25 of them are like watching soccer on their laptops, whatever. The difference between what I was being told education could be, especially science education, and what I was seeing was so huge that I felt I had to do something about it, see if I could bring the education stuff into the computer science department. So I applied to do a PhD in STEM education here at Tufts. And that first application, the head of the program emailed me and said, like, we'd love to have you, but there's no money this year. So if you're willing to wait a year, there's going to be money next year. And literally, as I was reading that email, I got a text message from my advisor from college asking if I knew anybody with a master's or better who was free next year to teach at my alma mater, Cornell College. And I was like, I needed something to do for a year. So I went and taught at my alma mater. And then I came back, and now I'm doing this PhD.
Cool. How long have you been doing the PhD for, and which classes or parts of your background do you think have prepared you best for the start of that PhD?
Oh boy. Yeah, so this is year 4 of my PhD. In some ways, all of my background has prepared me really well. I came into this PhD with a very particular idea, and it's a PhD in STEM education. I came into the PhD with a real idea of how I thought computer science should be taught, which has been a huge boon to kind of have that, here's what I think works. But as soon as you go, I think this works, the faculty are like, okay, why does it work? Show us that it works. And I was completely unprepared. I had no tools to answer those questions. And so the last 4 years have been a real slog. Exciting, I'm learning a lot, but I've been a real battle to try to acquire those tools to explain, here's why I think this works, and here is how I can show you that I'm right about that. Education as a research field is a social science, and it's completely different from anything I've done before in that way.
You have a ton of really interesting articles, or at least the abstracts of the articles that I want to get into. So maybe I'll start with letting you talk about them at a high level, and maybe tell me if there's one or two that you really want to dive into a lot of detail on, or something you definitely don't want to talk about, anything like that.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I'll start with a high level, the thing I was struggling with. Why does this work? How do you show that it works? I guess let me start by turning it back on you. What the heck is learning?
That's a really broad question. I really latched onto one of your papers about, maybe it's a poster. It was titled "Skip the Lecture: A Decoding First Approach to Introductory Computing Education." Mm-hmm. I really think learning, in a broad sense, is about not only learning knowledge and facts, but also trying to build up skills and reasoning and analyzing things at different levels all at the same time. I don't know how to put that into proper STEM education terms, but that's, I guess, in a broad sense, what it means to me. I'll pause.
Yeah, no. So that's a spectacular start, right? So one of the first hard things that I've had to learn here is that we still don't understand the brain well enough to say exactly what learning is or how it works. And there's even disagreement about whether we learn all things the same way. There are folks out there who say when you're learning to catch a football, that's a different type of learning. There's something different going on there from when you're remembering when the Battle of Waterloo happened. The punchline is that there's all these different ways people think learning works. And that makes a really big difference to how you teach, how you research, and kind of what you're looking for from the students. A famous learning idea is the Pavlov positive and negative reinforcement, repetitive reinforcement. Pavlov had this idea that learning is when you combine two things over and over again until people understand that they happen at the same time. So he did this experiment with dogs. Right before he fed them, he rang a bell, and he showed that when he rings the bell now, the dogs start to drool because they know that the food is coming and they're preparing to eat. That's one way to think about learning. If you think learning works that way, you might bring kindergartners into the classroom every day, and if they walk in quietly in a line, you give them each a piece of candy, or you give them a star. Or if they're not in the line, you might yell at them, give them a demerit, or spank them, right? Any list of things. That's one way you might think learning happens. Other folks, sports folks, certainly think that learning is something that is involved with doing and with moving, right? If I wanted to teach you how to catch a football, I'm not going to bring you into a lecture hall and explain the mechanics of football catching, right? I'm going to tell you, go out to the other end of the field. I'm going to throw 100 balls at you. And maybe I'll critique. Maybe I'll say, actually, do it more this way, do it more that way. But it's about a repetitive motion. And you can go on and on and on. There's dozens of different learning ideas. And so in the Skip the Lecture paper, we're taking a particular approach to what we think learning is. And the approach we're taking for that paper, let me pull it up so I make sure I'm not lying to you. I wrote it a couple of years ago. Is the approach we're taking for that paper is an approach called use, modify, create. And it's based on the idea that when you learn how to program, when you're learning a coding language, it's actually a 3-step process. The first step is to use existing code to start to grow an understanding of how code works. The second step is to change the code so that you can start to grow an understanding of how you can change its behavior. And then the third step is to start to write code from scratch so that you start to learn what it is to create code from scratch, right? So use, modify, create. We talked a little bit about how that works in our classroom, but we also connected it to a kind of bigger theory of learning, which is that it's called discovery learning or inquiry learning. And it's based on the idea that people learn like scientists. They run experiments, they see the results, and that's what the learning process is. It's experimentation, question, experiment, answer. And so we kind of tied that question, experiment, answer process into each of use, modify, and create.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I appreciate you breaking it down with easy to understand words. I struggle sometimes to get folks on here who have been working in their fields for years and expect everyone has the same base understanding of vocabulary, which is fair in some sense if you've only been interacting with other people who study earthquake engineering for 10 years. Like, it makes sense that you're going to use those words that make a lot of sense to you and sound like gibberish to everyone else.
One of the funny things about computer science education is that the majority of researchers have not taken the step I have of going to get a degree in education. And so habitually, I know that I need to speak a common language, right? Because the folks I want to talk to don't have the background. They know everything there is to know about AI. And they're deciding to dabble in education research on the side or teach because they love it. Yeah. So it's an important part of my work.
So your research, in a broad sense, covers, if I'm understanding right, it covers computer science education, like how people can grow into better computer scientists and software engineers. Are there kind of any levels that you try to focus on, or any software engineering languages that you try to focus on, anything like that?
Yeah, so my research at the moment is very focused on introductory classes at the college level. One thing that's huge out in the world right now is a growing belief that everyone should know how to program, which is not the same as saying everybody should be a programmer, right? Or be a software engineer. Okay. In the same way that everyone should know how to write, but you're not necessarily a writer. Everyone should know how to program is this thing that's growing because it's just going to be useful everywhere. So one of the cool movements that's coming out now, and has been for many years, but it is growing still, is this kind of introductory computer science for blank. At the moment, my research is introductory computer science for engineers. But there's folks out there doing really cool work about introductory computer science for data scientists, which is still kind of STEM-y. But then there's like introductory computer science for classics majors. What does an introductory computer science course look for a classics major? And there's like very real direct answers to that question. They want to know how many times this word is used in a book or across ancient Greek writing that we have, right? And it used to be that you could do a PhD in classics and spend 5 years counting up how many times a particular type of verb was used in the Odyssey. And it would take you 5 years just to go through and count, right, in the whole book. Now we can do that if you know how to program in a couple seconds, and it can be a small part of a large research program. And so there's a whole world out there of introductory computer science for jocks. Probably the most famous computer scientist in the sports world is who's the 538 guy?
Nate Silver?
Nate Silver, right? We should have computer science classes for football players who want to understand Nate Silver and who want to take a data approach to their game. For art majors who want to make programmatic art, for music majors who want to design their own synths, right? So that would be a cool place to go.
Absolutely. I don't know how closely you follow basketball, but there's been a big push recently saying that statisticians and computer scientists have like ruined the NBA because so many players now focus on 3-point shots that it's gets a little repetitive to watch in real time, where most of the time down the court, that's what they're aiming for, just based on statistics kind of thing. I also come from that background, so I also take the approach of like, oh, let's dig into the stats and see how we can win more games kind of thing. But at the same time, I think it's interesting that we're almost getting a push now for the opposite of people trying to use programming and statistics to figure out how to make the games more balanced and how to make the games where they end up in those spots less frequently.
Sure. Yeah. Make them more interesting. Why not? The NBA should spend an off season with a bunch of players trying different court configurations and define what an interesting play is and see what court configuration causes the most interesting plays or the most exciting games. Why not?
Sorry, I totally distracted us. So going back to your research, what methods have you found working the best so far?
My main idea of teaching is that I think in computer science, we talk too much at the student, especially in those introductory courses, right? I think ultimately, in a kind of very simplified language, programming is something you do, much in the same way that catching a football is something you do. And so those lectures, they're important. We need them. One thing I have found is that if you take the lectures away entirely, students really struggle. But I think we spend way too much time doing the lecture. I've taken a couple different approaches. The one I'm taking now draws from second language acquisition research. So how do you learn a foreign language? How do you learn French? So that's, again, like a different way of thinking about what learning is. At the moment, I'm really focused on learning to program is like learning French in some way. The thing they've known for about 50 years with foreign language stuff is that when we learn foreign languages, we're learning different stuff. And it's important to hit each one of those things that you want to learn, right? In the same way that like if you were to go work out, you need to work out the different muscle groups. And so the two big muscle groups that people describe in second language acquisition are what they call formal or explicit learning or explicit knowledge, and then implicit knowledge or learning. And the explicit stuff are all of the rules that you can say out loud. Every sentence must have a verb and end in a period, right? That's an explicit rule about English. The implicit stuff is really interesting. If I tell you Blue Mountain Big Bike, is that an okay thing to say in English?
Yeah, I don't think it means anything to me, but sure.
What about Big Blue Mountain Bike?
Big Blue Mountain Bike. Yeah, getting closer to a phrase that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, so Big Blue Mountain Bike is like, it's correct English. There's an order of those words that is allowed, and Blue Mountain Big Bike is not allowed. And why Blue Mountain Big Bike sounds wrong and Big Blue Mountain Bike sounds fine is something that linguists know, but most of us just go around in the world saying it correctly without actually knowing what the rule is. And that saying it correctly without knowing what the rule is, that's the implicit stuff. And that comes about from just having heard a lot of English, from having read a lot of English, from having spoken a lot of English, and people saying, no, it's not velvet new dress, it's new velvet dress, right? And so I'm really interested in that implicit stuff and how we grow it in students. And the short version, I think, of how we grow it in students is to have them interact with code, read it, write it, think about it, and not listen to a professor describe how it works.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How much time would you say you spend studying how people learn foreign languages versus how people learn coding languages? And like, I guess how much of an overlap is there, or do you generally try to separate those for some reason?
I guess the argument I'm making is that they're very similar. And so in some ways, whenever I'm studying one, I'm studying the other. The programming languages stuff, I'm in a classroom 3 days a week watching students do it and recording them on video, and I collect all their homework, and not just the end result of their homework, but actually every single letter they typed while doing it, everything they deleted. I'm trying to study the history of how they got to where they got. Recently, we've started strapping heart rate and temperature sensors onto the students to try to understand if they get stressed during certain parts of the class. Right, so like, in terms of where my research is, it's in computer science classrooms. In terms of what I go home and read every night to prepare to write a better research paper, these days, it's actually mostly second language stuff. I try to keep current with computer science ed research. I go to the conferences, but I have like 3 books on my bedside table about how we learn second languages.
How would you say that kind of approach is accepted by the computer science community?
So far, it's been really well accepted. I've published a short paper about it, just 4 pages, and right now I'm trying to finish up and then publish a 40-page paper about it. So I'll let you know what kind of pushback I get from the bigger paper. But I took the 4-page paper to a conference last summer and got a lot of excited feedback. And when I talk to people about this stuff, they go, oh, yes, that explains this thing we see where, I lecture to the students, they tell me they understand the rules, I ask them about the rules, they understand the rules, and then they sit down to write the assignment and nothing comes out of their fingers, right? I hope it's a good explanation of that very, very common problem.
Yeah, that's a hard one with stuff like programming, because I feel like even programming now in my career outside of school, there are definitely times when I try to sit down and don't really know where to start. And a lot of times I get through that by just starting somewhere, and it's usually not the right place. And so I have to go back and retype things and reorganize code, and that's fine because most of my code isn't that complicated. But yeah, if there are rules of where to start or best practices to start with, yeah, I could totally see that being helpful, especially to a beginner.
It's funny, the thing I want to give them is exactly the opposite of the rules and the best practices, right? It's the...
Oh, really?
Well, it's kind of... Imagine a kid who's listened to 600 fairy tales growing up and you ask them to tell a story. Are they going to start with once upon a time because somebody told them it's best practice or it's a rule? No, they don't have to think about it. It's not a rule. I'm sure they've heard fairy tales that start other ways. But they've heard 400 iterations of the once upon a time story. And so the page will immediately start to get filled up with once upon a time in. And I think if students read enough code, you get them there as well, right? Instead of staring at that blank page, they at least start with once upon a time. Or they know the kind of program they're trying to write, and so they go, okay, I've read something like this before, so why don't I recreate some of that from memory and now start off in the direction I want it to go. You can stand at the front of the room and say, what programming language do you work in? Python? R?
Yeah, mostly Python. I know Python and R pretty well.
So I could tell students, when you sit down and you open that document, just start by writing import pandas. Start by writing import numpy as np. That way the page isn't empty anymore.
That's funny. I hadn't thought about it like that.
But I think it's better if they just see 35 programs that start with those 2 lines, and when they sit down, they just do it because that's what they do. They don't have to think about what was it David said that I should do at the beginning of writing my program.
How about pushback from students? Do you ever get some that really prefer learning differently, or at least say they prefer learning differently and don't want to try new methods? Does that vary by subject area? Like if we're coming from a sociology background versus math background, anything like that?
I can't think of any pushback we've gotten. We mostly teach first years, and so they kind of, I think, have a less static view of what college should be than seniors. Seniors sometimes will just be like, I don't, this, but I don't teach seniors, so I don't know. The funniest pushback we've gotten, the very first time that I helped teach this Intro CS course I do my research in, we had a student write a review that said something along the lines of, this class was really slow and I really feel like we didn't cover enough, we didn't learn enough. I mean, admittedly, I feel like I've really mastered Python and I'm ready to learn a new program, a second programming language, but I really feel like the class was a waste of time. And it's like,
Just directly contradicting himself.
yeah, in one semester you learned Python and you feel ready for a second programming language. Like, I'm glad you feel like we could have covered more, but man, did we do what I hoped we would do.
It was too easy. You made it too good on him.
Yeah. Aside from that, I don't know. We do a lot of things, I think, because they're good practice that also happen to like avoid student pushback. We like to give in the class pretty hard homework assignments, but every homework assignment, you have the option to go meet with the professor and redo it, right? Like, oh, I got a 60 out of 100. Okay, go home, fix it, come talk to me about it, and we'll give you some points back.
In a good way. I think that's really generous.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Like, I think you could view it as generous. I think that's a totally valid way to view it. On the other hand, it's like, man, my goal is just to have them spend time programming, and the student is going to go home and do some more programming. Like, great. We're both winning.
Okay. So that brings me back to why I like that paper so much that I mentioned earlier, the Skip the Lecture, a Decoding First Approach to Computing Education. Like, it seems like you're taking a really rigorous approach to ensure learning rather than, quote, weeding students out, unquote. Not to make this too much about myself, but at my undergrad, there were a ton of classes, especially in chemistry, in physics, and math, where the professors, not that they necessarily took pride in knocking kids down a peg, but they definitely made the tests as challenging as possible. And then it would sometimes round up at the very end of the semester, or sometimes not. We had a math grad student who was teaching multivariable calculus. The average on one of the tests was a 64. And we asked him if he was going to round it. And he said, I don't understand why I would do that. Like, I don't understand why people need the scores to be rounded. So, of course, myself and a bunch of other people dropped the course because we didn't want to fail. But I'm just kind of curious how you've seen that attitude vary across departments. Are there certain factors that certain professors focus on as to like why weeding out students is important? Is it just kind of an attitude shift that needs to change across academia? A bunch of questions in there, but feel free to talk about what you want to talk about here.
Yeah, I mean, there's like all kinds of baggage around the weed out course. I think it's a horrible thing that we do to students to do those weed out courses. I think, historically there's a story you can tell where in computer science or in biology, there's like only so many seats in the lab for the 201 course. And so you want to figure out which students deserve those seats in the lab. But in the 21st century, like certainly in computer science, every student has a laptop. They don't need seats in a lab. And in biology and in chemistry, those labs are humongous and run with hundreds of students anyway. So I think that excuse is gone. I think so it's funny, there can be like real advantages to making courses really hard. There are some education faculty who make courses really, really hard, but they always try to balance it. The education faculty I know always try to balance it with, I want this course to be challenging and I don't want you to be thinking about your grade, right? This is about challenging yourself, about pushing yourself, about working really hard, about mastering the material. if I see that effort, you're not going to get that F, that D, that C, right? Increasingly at Tufts, the intro physics courses are actually done kind of ungraded. The school makes you assign a grade at the end of the semester, but none of the assignments get graded. You just get like feedback about what you got right and what you got wrong, but there's no score on it. With the hope being that in that kind of situation, you can tell a student like, yeah, you got half the questions wrong here for small ways, but there's none of that. Does half the questions wrong mean a 75% because we saw your work and gave you credit for that? Or does it mean 50% because you got it wrong and it's just right or wrong, right? It's about feedback and learning and growth. And then at the end, the professor gives you whatever grade based on something that's invisible to you. Hopefully you worry about it less. I think there's also just the approach, though, of like, why make it hard when you can make it inspiring instead? I think making it inspiring is its own unique challenge, right? But if it's not inspiring, are students going to work as hard as they need to get through the stuff you're getting through? Long story short, the Weed Out course has a long and sad history, I think, across STEM. And on the flip side, I guess I should say, when I came into this program, I thought, man, Weed Out courses, gross, horrible. Making courses difficult, gross, horrible. I still think the Weed Out courses are gross, but I was interviewing a student last week, and they were telling me about getting a 62 out of 100 on an exam. And I asked them, do you feel like you failed? And they said, well, I'm a sophomore. My freshman year, I took this physics course where it was like normal to get half the questions wrong on the exam. And the professor would hand us back these exams where we got half the questions wrong. And he would say like, man, I'm so impressed by how well everybody did. I can really see your learning. I can see from your work that you are going to master these concepts, right? I gave you something difficult to chew on and you chewed mightily. And so she said, I got this 62 on the exam in this sophomore year course, and it didn't feel like failure. I didn't need the professor to tell me you're doing well, you're going to figure it out. I reoriented, I shifted my idea about what success looks like. And I know that I'm in a world where like a 62, where I feel like I was chewing on the questions effectively, I'm going to be fine. And I like, man, that's valuable. Man, can you push somebody harder when they're there and they can learn more and they can do amazing things. But you have to balance that, right? Especially, I read a lot about the world of DEI. And we know that 60 out of 100 on an exam can be a lot more damaging to people who don't look like the professors and the TAs and like everybody else in the class. And so there's a lot of balance there. Education is an art as much as it is a science. But there's a lot of value to giving people exams where they get a 60.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And I like the feedback of the professor saying, you guys all got 50% on the exam. Congratulations. That's great. Like,
yeah.
I don't know, just a different
Which is so different.
I haven't heard that before.
From, I've seen the classroom where the professor walks out, you all got 50% on the exam. The average was a 50. If you got below a 55, I recommend dropping the course and choosing a different major. That's gross. That's disgusting that it still exists out in the world. That professor gives that same exam and that same speech every semester, and that person is infuriating. But there's a balance.
Yeah, sure. So then another question I had with the learning process, and maybe like a couple of new challenges I was thinking about in the computer science field in recent years. Big uptick in software engineering job postings during 2020, 2021, part of 2022. And then there's been a huge uptick after that of computer science graduates. And it now seems like there's maybe too many graduates for the number of jobs that are currently available, at least from the data that I've seen online and experiences I've heard of like fellow people working in the tech world and finance world and things like that. Curious if you've kind of seen that from your end as well, and kind of how the academia world is reacting to that these days.
That's an interesting one. So I entered the tech world in 2013, and 2013 to 2016, 2017, I'd say was like a peak in hiring. It was very easy to get a software engineering job, comparatively speaking, right? The world was desperate and there weren't enough of us. Um, Certainly, I've seen a shift in that in the last 6, 7 years. And I don't have the numbers at hand about what's kind of causing that shift. From what I've seen, though, I got an email about this a couple days ago. The number of jobs for non-credentialed programmers seems to be diving somewhat hard, like a 15% reduction, right? So that's folks who are programmers but who don't have a degree in engineering or computer science. The number of jobs for computer science graduates, from what I've seen, has not changed significantly in the last 3 or 4 years. Again, like nowhere near the desperation of 10 years ago. Desperation, I mean like ease of finding that job. But from what I understand, it's not changing as much. Um, Certainly the economy is a fickle beast. I mean, I don't know how old you are. I don't know if you remember 2008, when the jobs all disappeared up in smoke. Um, in 2020, again, the jobs seemed to disappear for a year or so. Um, and so I think it's hard to say where that's going. I'll say from the point of view of academia, I don't see much changing. Um, we've maybe peaked in the number of computer science majors across the country. Um, it's the growth in computer science majors has been insane. The Tufts CS department in 2020, I think, had like 200 majors across the 4 years, and now it's nearly 1,000.
Oh my God.
Something like that. I mean, the numbers are just insane.
The other more modern challenge that we've definitely seen proliferate in the last couple of years is large language models, especially
Sure.
when it comes to coding practices. I will freely admit that I love some aspects of it, hate some aspects of it, totally understand how it can be really helpful in some cases and really misleading in other cases. I feel like I've gotten kind of a good slice of the extremes from large language models over the last couple of years. Curious, I guess, to hear from you how you've seen large language models work when it comes to teaching coding practices. Good, bad, neutral, just a changing environment altogether.
Yeah, I guess so. I'll start with the good because I mostly think it's bad. Um, so the good, I have a lot of friends who are data scientists or who are doing degrees in data science at the moment. And if you're a data scientist and you're trying to understand some new data science technique, let's say structural equation modeling or social network modeling, right? There's like these complicated data science things. And you're really working to understand the math and the data and the questions and the answers. That's a place where these large language models can be really useful, right? Because instead of adding, okay, now I also have to understand how this language works that I'm programming in, or this new coding library that lets me do the structural equation modeling works, I can hand that off to one of the large language models to handle, and I can focus on the other parts. That's seems to me like probably a good way to use these. The bad is if the thing you want to do is learn how to program, and I think if you're even working as a software engineer, you are not done learning how to program. LLMs will get in the way of that because part of the way we learn is by doing, and if the LLM is doing it for you, you're not doing it. At the intro level, we see students use LLMs sometimes. In our classes, we just say it's cheating, don't do it, but that doesn't stop them. And they don't learn. I just got back from a computer science education conference. There were probably 20 talks I went to about LLM assisted learning strategies, and 90% of them said what we found was that the students learned less when they used the LLMs. Even the classes that they're trying to design around using LLMs to assist in learning, it seems to get in the way. And I have friends who are still working, software engineers in the startup world, in the software world. And what they find is that software engineers who use LLMs produce code a little bit faster, maybe 10 or 20% faster, but they don't get any better. They don't learn how to make the important decisions. They don't learn how to do the high-level architecture. When there's bugs and you say, hey, could you fix the bug? They go, I actually don't know how the code works. So I'm going to need to spend a lot of time figuring out what was written for me so I can fix it. And so, you just end up in this place where junior engineers use LLMs and they're never going to get good enough that you want them to be senior engineers or software architects. Because they're not doing the work.
It's that much of a impact even when you're on the job, you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One of the realities of almost any job is that you're going to learn more in those first 6 months than you did in 4 years of school, right? And if something or somebody else is doing your work, boy, are you not going to learn. That doesn't stop being true when you get to the job.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And then are there any other research projects that you liked a lot and wanted to highlight here as having some interesting takeaways for people coming up in the computer science world?
There's some folks out there doing some really interesting work on computer science ed in prisons, which I think is really interesting and important. I'll say, actually, the thing I'm most interested out there from other researchers is folks who are trying to bring ethics and what we call socio-technical thinking into computer science ed. I think we live in a reality where Mark Zuckerberg almost destroyed American democracy by accident. And there's folks out there trying to train the next generation of computer scientists so that at least if they build the next Facebook, they're going to do it on purpose and with full knowledge of what it is they're building.
No, that's interesting. But I guess, are you guys kind of instituting classes for ethics by themselves or trying to interweave them with other courses right now? Or how does that look from your perspective?
That's the big debate, is should you have the standalone or the interweave? And it seems like the answer is to do both. Certainly Intro CS class I help teach. Every other week we're doing an assignment where we ask students to kind of think sociologically, socio-technically about the world. They're doing a project right now looking at how rooftop solar deployment across the United States breaks down by race and income. At the end of the semester, we're going to have them do a project where they study some census data about the city of Houston to decide where it would be best to put a new community college branch, stuff like that. But there's also folks out there, I think, doing really interesting work with the standalone ethics courses. How do you design an ethics course around engineers or software people?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then you also had a project with, if I remember right, it was a project of bringing robotics and machine learning to elementary school age kids. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how that went.
That was so much fun. I got to spend 2 summers in St. Louis having students build some AI-enabled Lego robots. So I put the AI on the robots in advance. Actually, it's machine learning. We stuck to simple things, just linear regression and nearest neighbor models. I don't want to go too far into what those are. And then had students build robots and do things. It's super fun. The students have a blast. Lego is a spectacular tool for teaching all kinds of things. As a person who's like really into the computer science ed, robots are so hard. If you want students to learn computer science, don't give them robots. They're too cool.
Oh, really?
There's too many other things to work on. Well, yeah, so for a functioning robot, right, you need the software to work right. You need the mechanical engineering to work right, of like, are all the pieces in the right places? And then also there's just like these physics realities that have to work out. So we had students working with color sensors, and color sensors are so titchy. If something is red and shiny, it's going to say it's white. If it's, not bright enough in the room, or if the color sensor is too close or too far away from a thing, you're going to get all these weird readings. And so the students had a blast. They learned a lot. But I was kind of sitting there being like, I want you to learn the computer science. And they were like building catapult arms and trying to get the catapult arm to work correctly. And so it's a funny balance there.
That's funny. Yeah, they must have loved that. I would have loved that as a kid, at least, building a catapult.
They did.
What's been your favorite project so far?
The one I find most professionally fulfilling is this Intro CS class and the research I'm doing on it. It feels really important. The most fun, I got to take 3 students with my advisor to Cartagena, Colombia for a couple weeks, for 10 days, to do some engineering work out there. And if your job offers to take you to the Caribbean in January, it's pretty hard to beat that. And then you get to do cool work, cool research, meet fascinating people, make the world a slightly better place. Like, boy, that was a dream come true.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And then the last question I have here is, if things in your life had gone a little bit differently, and maybe you weren't in graduate school right now, and maybe this question doesn't fit you super well because you had your own mini career before even going back to graduate school. But if you weren't in school right now, what would your dream job be? Was there anything you'd want to be doing? Like, you've had people talk about opening up, I think, like a fishing shop, or being a basketball coach or something like that, a travel journalist, anything like that at all. Just kind of curious to hear from people.
Yeah, if I had $1 billion, I would open a restaurant, cafe, bookstore, and it would lose a lot of money.
Yeah, that's a
and
good
it
one
would
too.
only be open on days that I like felt like doing it. I absolutely love cooking and reading books. So just to hang out in a professional kitchen and come up with fun recipes, and I'd probably hire other people to do the actual slog of the day-to-day cookery, because I haven't worked in a restaurant, but I
that
have
can be a
friends. I'm aware of the grind that it is. But in my dream, I have this silly restaurant that loses a lot of money. Yeah.
Perfect. All right, David, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. Do you have any other questions for me, or anything else you want to say to people before log off here?
In the world as it is today, I hope you think scientific research is important and deserves funding and trust. I'd say that's the biggest thing.
Yep, that's always a good one to end on. Thanks so much again, David.
Thank you. Talk to you later.